Troghon guided his small, cloaked scout ship through the planet's turbulent upper thermosphere, killing the main thrusters early to glide silently beneath the radar grid of the mining facility. He touched down miles away from the sector grid, burying the ship deep within a jagged, obsidian canyon where the rust-colored dust storms would naturally conceal its silhouette. He popped the canopy, stepped out onto the warm red rock, and drew a sharp breath of the sulfur-tinged air. The two red suns beat down on him, casting long, bloody shadows across the desolate terrain. It was a brutal landscape, but Troghon was no stranger to harsh worlds. He pulled his hood up over his long brown hair, adjusted the straps of his twin daggers, and began the long, solitary trek toward the mines. With every heavy step across the cracked earth, the silence of the desert allowed old voices to bleed back into his mind. He hadn't been born into a life of shadows and blades. His mind drifted back to his childhood at a far gentler time, before Van and his Krigeres burned his world to ash. He remembered the soft, vibrant colors of his ancestors' fortress and the quiet peace of a life that felt a universe away from the assassin he had become. "This isn't what they wanted for you, Troghon." The voice echoed in his memory so clearly, it felt as though the old man was walking right beside him in the red dust. It was the voice of his adoptive father, the man who had escaped with Troghon and taught him how to survive. They had argued the night before Troghon stole away to Clison. "Your mother and your father, they didn't throw themselves into the fire so you could burn yourself up for a ghost," his adoptive father had pleaded, his voice cracking with age and desperate love. "They sacrificed their lives so that you could have one. They wanted you to hide, to breathe, to live, Troghon. This revenge, it isn't worth it. It's a trap that will swallow you whole." Troghon had kept his back turned during the lecture, meticulously polishing his weapons because he couldn't bear to look into the old man's eyes. "If I just live, father, then the monsters who took them win. Their legacy ends in silence. I cannot allow that." "And what about my legacy?" his adoptive father had shouted back. "I raised a son." Walking through the heat of Clison, Troghon gripped the hilt of his blade. He loved his adoptive father, but the old man didn't understand the fire that had been burning in his chest. He was prepared for this. His adoptive father had tried to raise him in peace, but Troghon had secretly sought out the most brutal mentors across the galaxy. He had spent years breaking his body, mastering the art of silent infiltration, pressure point strikes, and psychological warfare. He had trained until his movements were as instinctual as breathing, transforming himself into the ultimate weapon, specifically to cut the head off the Krigere command. Warlord Van was coming to these mines in 3 weeks, and Troghon had spent his entire life preparing to greet him. Up ahead, the jagged horizon finally gave way to the massive, imposing structures of the Clison slave mines. The smoke from the smelting factories choked out the red sunlight. Troghon slowed his pace, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed the guard towers and patrol paths. The journey was over. The hunt had officially begun. Troghon scaled the jagged cliffs, overlooking the main courtyard of the facility, his movements fluid and entirely silent. He flattened himself against the warm, dark rock, pulling his hood forward to blend into the shadows of the precipice. From this high advantage, the entire mining grid was laid out below him like a tactical map. He pulled a small pair of high-powered visual scanners from his belt and pressed them to his eyes, focusing on the courtyard where the daily rations were being distributed. He needed to map the layout, Count the guard rotations before Warlord Van's ship arrives. But as he adjusted the lens focus, something entirely unexpected caught his eye. A figure was stepping out of the block entrances, moving hesitantly into the open courtyard. Troghon zoomed in, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. It was a woman, a human woman. She stood at the edge of the dust-choked quadrant, her head tilted back as she gazed up at the twin red suns dominating the skyline. Troghon's mind raced, trying to pass the tactical logic of her presence. Women were never brought to the subterranean labor camps of Clison. The Krigere code regarding captives was strict and absolute. Women were considered high-value assets, never subjected to the dirt and brutality of the slave trenches. Why is she here? Troghon thought, his eyes tracking her every move. Did Van's transport make an error? Before he could answer his own question, a loud command bellowed through the courtyard. "Stow op og beveg dig." Through his scanners, Troghon watched a massive guard stride aggressively toward one of the long, packed tables. With a sharp gesture, the guard ordered a group of male prisoners to vacate their seats. He cleared a table just for her, offering a respectful, almost submissive smile as he gestured for her to sit. A moment later, a servant brought her a steaming, heavy plate of actual meat and gravy, a luxury meal reserved only for high-ranking officers, while the men who had been forced from the table sat on the hard earth, chewing on meager crusts of dry bread. Troghon shifted his scanners slightly to the left, focusing on the displaced men sitting on the ground near the edge of her table. 3 specific Earthmen caught his attention. They weren't cowering like some of the other inmates. Even while sitting on the dirt, their posture was disciplined, watchful, and dangerous. The oldest of the 3, a graying, hardened man, and next to him sat a younger, pale-faced prisoner, but it was the third one who made Troghon pause. He was a powerfully built, serious-looking man, staring at the woman with an intense, protective gaze that Troghon recognized all too well. It was the look of a warrior. Troghon memorized their faces: the elder, the kid, the protector, and the mysterious woman who had the entire Krigere garrison on guard. Suddenly, a sharp metallic bell rang out across the canyon, shattering the moment. Below, the guards began herding the prisoners back toward the dark trenches, shouting, "Till bake, till job!" Troghon lowered his scanners, his mind working rapidly. The presence of the human woman changed everything. The guards were distracted by her, stressed by her presence, and terrified of breaking their own cultural laws. It was a glaring vulnerability in the facility's security grid. A cold smile touched Troghon's lips beneath his hood. He looked down at the strong, serious man, leading the other 2 back into the dark mines, then back toward the woman left alone at the table. If he was going to kill Warlord Van in 3 weeks, these humans might be exactly the chaos he needed to pull it off. For the next 7 days, Troghon became a ghost in the obsidian cliffs. He slept in brief, disciplined intervals during the planet's freezing night cycles and spent every waking hour mapping the choreography of the facility. He learned the exact timing of the guard rotations. He noted that the elite guards checked the perimeter precisely every 4 hours, while the grunts took the grueling 8-hour shifts in the suffocating heat of the lower trenches. He watched the 3 human men function as a protective shield around the woman, whom walked freely around the courtyard. Everything was precise. Every variable was being calculated. Troghon prided himself on flawless preparation. His adoptive father had always warned him that impatience was the quickest way to end up in a grave. He was on track to execute his strike exactly when Warlord Van's ship was scheduled to break the atmosphere in 2 weeks. Flattened against a ventilation shaft near the eastern barracks, Troghon pressed his audio receiver to the metal grate, listening to the guttural Krigere officers talking below. "The atmospheric shield needs to be at full capacity by tomorrow night," the first officer barked, his armor clanking as he paced. "We don't have the luxury of 2 weeks anymore." "Tomorrow?" the second guard asked, his voice laced with stress. Why the sudden change? Warlord Van's itinerary was set. "The Warlord's desires have changed," the first officer replied smoothly. "Word reached the flagship about the Earth Woman. Van is entirely consumed by the news. A genuine human female, completely intact, right here in his territory. He wants to claim her before the High Council can intervene. His dreadnought altered its course yesterday. He arrives in 7 days." The guards' voices faded as they walked deeper into the barracks, but Troghon remained completely frozen against the rock, the sulfur wind whipping against his hood. His entire 3-week timeline had just vanished. The meticulous plan he had spent a week perfecting was completely useless. If Van arrived in 7 days, Troghon wouldn't have time to systematically dismantle the perimeter security or orchestrate a silent assassination. He looked down toward the dimly lit courtyard, where the red security lights cast long, bloody shadows across the dirt. He needed to establish a foothold inside the facility at once, and he needed allies who were just as desperate to see Van fail as he was. Troghon gripped the hilt of his twin daggers, his eyes locking onto the dark corridor that led to the cell blocks. It was time to stop watching from the cliffs.